Philosophers say, I don't even fully know that you're conscious, and you don't fully know I'm conscious. We kind of make a guess. How conscious is a dog? What about a worm, a turtle? That's really hard. And it's just as hard when we deal with artificial beings. So I think these are really difficult problems that nobody now really knows how to solve.
I think I definitely agree. And it seems that, I mean, consciousness and the idea of sentience is at the forefront of all of these discussions, just because, can we, when you start mixing things like, for example, if Chat GPT makes you laugh, you start ascribing, and say Chat GPT tells you a joke every day and you feel happy, do you start ascribing, or people say, thank you, Alexa, and they start feeling like Alexa's a real, a real person. But do you think that, reversely, that these developments in AI will help us actually better illuminate the mystery of how we define or understand consciousness?
It's a good question. There's a lot of people would argue that the success of these AIs is of relevance to psychology. So it shows that these AIs work, they're basically prediction machines. They're statistical analyzers that make predictions about the future. And they don't involve, they're not logic machines. They're some people call them stochastic parrots. And then some people said, well, the fact that they're so successful at reasoning their way through the world maybe means that we're just stochastic parrots, as some people say. We're just statistical machines. I don't believe that, but I think that rather there are two sorts of ways to be intelligent, at least, and one is what the machines do, and one is what we do. You can ask the same question about consciousness. So I'd like to think in principle, you're right, that the study of the struggling to figure out whether these things are sentient or not will be relevant to psychology and study of the human mind. I'm not exactly sure how at this point, but I think you're probably right in your guess.
I think, and it's really interesting that you mentioned, the idea of logic and whether or not they are logical. And it makes us think of, when we turn back to ourselves and our own minds, we like to pride ourselves. Humans have long liked to pride themselves for their capacity to have rational thinking. But from studies in psychology, can we say whether our trust in our own rationality is correct?
So it's a question which fascinates me in the debate that fascinates me. You probably ask a lot of psychologists, say, oh, humans aren't rational at all. Danny Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for showing we're subject to all these illusions. We believe in conspiracy theories. We make logical mistakes. We struggle to get things right. I actually think humans are extraordinarily rational. That one of the findings, both of psychology, but also thinking about everyday life, is how smart we are at dealing with the world. It's true, if you doubt that, try to imagine what it would be like to have your IQ drop by 30 points, or to have a stroke that means your frontal lobe wouldn't work properly. And you'd appreciate how important your intelligence is for making its way through the world. And in fact, we've developed these AIs that engage in conversation at an abstract level. We haven't developed a machine that could do the dishes or walk across from one side of the room to another without stumbling, walk across the street without getting hit by a car or something. These things humans do. It takes us years to develop the skills, but our intelligence is so powerful and our rationality is so powerful, we then really notice when we get it wrong. And in fact, I like to think of the cases where we get rationality wrong, like when we believe in a conspiracy theory, or when we make a logical fallacy of some sort. It's very similar to visual illusions. So you don't also see these visual illusions. Oh my gosh, it looks like this line is bigger, but it's really the same size. It looks like that's moving, but it's really still. And those show, in some way, flaws of the visual system. But what nobody denies is the visual system gets it right 99.999% of the time. And only when you kind of trick it does it get it wrong. I think that's true for our rationality more generally.
I think that is really fascinating. And if anything, I really appreciate that you appreciate the rationality of humans. I think, especially today, we often have, there's a lot of emotionally driven politics, for example, which makes us question, like, can we even be rational? And I wonder has psychology showed, for example, whether or not either when we are, I would like to think that, individually, you and I are rational and are capable of sounding things out. But when we think in groups, does that change? Does the psychology change? And, the larger the group is, or perhaps the more distance the interface, does that change our psychology as well and how rational we can be?
So in some way, and this is, I think, where you're tilting the question towards, being in groups makes us worse. When you're part of a mob, you might act in ways you wouldn't as an individual because you're not responsible for your actions. Being in a group sets up strong pressures for conformity. So there's all these cases where there's a whole community and everybody says something. And then if you took them aside and asked them, do you believe that? Think whatever hot button. Do you believe that? They say, no, but everybody else does. So I don't want to break the crowd. And everybody thinks that. There's a communal delusion that this is what everybody believes. So that's true. But also thinking in groups makes us extraordinarily smart. That's where technology comes from, and culture and science. So take science. I'm exploring a question, right? And I have all sorts of biases to think that my theory is right, to try to interpret the data my way. But I'm in a community of scientists and they have their own biases. And so they know when I'm saying bullshit, they call me on it and I call them on it. And when the procedure works out right, we get progress. And in fact, we have extraordinary theories of the mind, of the physical world, of chemistry, biology, physics, and so on, that we've come to through working as communities and would have special ways of doing things. I think in some way, the human capacity for rationality is at its very best in the right sort of group, where people are sort of calling one another on their weaknesses and working together to find the truth. It's a very optimistic worldview.
I mean, I think, if anything, I do think we need optimism in today's world. And I think you're right, even there's the peer review, for example, for scientific and academic communities, which is so important. And then there's also even on the artistic side, in the arts, in creative writing workshops, there is something that people, I guess, through the ages have sensed that there is importance in being together and thinking together.
I think in every discipline you could imagine, even lone geniuses, and there are some lone geniuses, but even they benefit from the insights of people who came before them. There's an accumulation to it, even in the moral realm. You and I believe slavery is wrong, but we didn't come up with that insight ourselves. We didn't wake up and say, it's wrong. Rather, other people came with the insight and we inherited it in kind of the same way we inherit the idea that water is H2O.
That is very true. And I guess, and it's interesting that you mentioned actually the idea of the lone genius. It makes us think, can we, in your book, you mentioned a lot about, you discuss in depth a lot of the studies that were devoted to child psychology, for example, and child development. And there are many parents now who always wonder, can we spot genius early on, or can we make a child into a genius? So what are your thoughts on that? Can we develop genius, or can we create genius?
In some way, yes. We certainly could rid kids of situations that staunch their abilities. And sometimes you don't need a psychologist to tell you this. In conditions where kids don't know how to read, are raised in extreme poverty, or have toxins or poisons in their environment, they're not going to flourish. So ideally, this isn't great insights from psychology, it's kind of common sense. You could set up situations where kids could flourish, where everybody could get a good education, everybody gets support, and so on. Now, I think when you do this, you're going to find individual differences, some of which are heritable. If we set up a situation where everybody has the same enormous opportunities in front of them, not everybody's going to grow up to be an Einstein. Not everyone's going to grow up to be a great musician or artist or athlete. In fact, the same question can be said about physicality, which is, if you want to have a great athlete like a Tiger Woods, you have to set up a situation so that he could flourish. On the other hand, if I was in this situation, I would not be a great golfer. There's certain natural gifts I lack. So yeah, I mean, you don't have to talk about it in terms of genius, which is kind of a fraught word, just in terms of people maximizing their potential. And I think good societies, and at a more local level, good parents set up a situation where kids could maximize their potential.
I think that is great. And indeed, I would agree with you. I think even if the opportunities are right, I probably would not be very great at certain sports. So I was wondering, before we move to audience questions, there is now, you mentioned a bit in your book about MBTI and personality tests. And there is a boom in the popularity of these tests, not only for fun, but even sometimes bring into corporate sectors, used in hiring processes. People say that's either a pseudoscience, some people swear by it. How accurate are these personality tests, and can they actually help us maximize our potential?
It depends on the test. So some tests, like the Myers-Briggs test, I mean, and it's not my specialty, but people in the field think it's total nonsense. It's just ridiculous. And if you can immediately see how it's ridiculous. It categorizes people's fall into categories. You're an introvert or you're an extrovert. Well, that's insane. The idea that that's going to be of any value at all. If you take introversion, extroversion as a continuum of human psychology, you can you would see that, and I think you should. You can see people fall in different points on the continuum. It's not yes or no. It's one of the many ways Myers-Briggs is terrible. I talk on my book. There's tests like which superhero are you? Which character in Succession are you? Those are fun. They have no value, but except for being fun, which is fun. I would never take them seriously. There are psychological measures that I think do capture real variation in people. Tests that capture sort of how open-minded you are, or how agreeable, extroverted, conscientiousness, neurotic. And we know these tests are good because they predict real world things. So I give you, somebody gives me an extroversion test, and then you ask them, how many sexual partners have you had? You score higher in the test, more sexual partners. And you somebody who's very very open-minded. How much do you travel? And it just connects. I'm not sure how useful these things are. I think I find them more theoretically interesting, because once you can use these tests to get a picture of somebody's personality, you can then ask questions like, what determines why somebody's extroverted or introverted? Is it genes? Is it environment? To what extent do they mix up? Are there country differences? Answer is yes. Are there sex differences? Answer is yes. Are there age differences? Answer is sort of, for some of them. We get, in some way, our personalities change as we get older. So I don't care about the practical stuff, but the theoretical stuff is very cool.
I think that is a great point for us to move into audience questions. So the first question is from Carmen, and she asks, do you have any tips, I guess, drawing from studies in psychology, for dealing with grief of a husband and father within 2 months of each other? I'm so sorry, Carmen, to hear this. And if do you have even, for example, a book recommendation for this?
No, I don't. I'm sorry to hear it. I want to be properly humble here and say I'm not a therapist, and I guess I would just say, talking to somebody, a professional in this, it tends to be a good idea. It's not a switch. I wrote my last book before Psych called The Sweet Spot, which is about suffering in everyday life. But it was about a different kind of suffering, about suffering we choose. And when we choose to take on a difficult task, or choose to experience some sort of pain, unchosen suffering is very different. And it's very hard on people. And time ultimately makes a big difference, but there are ways to speed up the process. But I don't have any recommendations. All I'll add is this wonderful quote by Zadie Smith, which was, she was talking about somebody else's advice to somebody who was grieving, which was, it hurts as much as it's worth. And I think that that's often true about grief, that often grief is a reasonable response and shows some degree of respect for the person. So I just say, I don't know, and I'll just send my best wishes.
Thank you for that. And I send my condolences as well to you, Carmen. Another question from Max asks, if one believes in determinism, does it take away from the importance of differentiating between AI and humans?
Oh, Max, this is a good question. There's a certain sense in that if one believes in determinism, it takes away from caring about anything. Forget about the beliefs in AI or different AI and humans. Belief in, if everything's determined in some way, you might say, how could we give value to one thing or another? How could we give credit for somebody winning the Olympics when that was no more the person's choice than being a certain height. And so some determinists believe all notions of credit and blame and praise go out the window. I myself am more of a compatibilist. So I believe in a deterministic universe. I believe in that there's a deep sense, it goes back to what we're talking about levels, that what we're going to do next is literally determined in that there's no way else it could happen given the state of the universe and physical laws. At the same time, when you're dealing with people, it's irresistible not to impose what the philosopher Strawson calls reactive attitudes of blame, of credit, and so on. So if somebody, if somebody cuts me off on the freeway, I'm gonna give them a middle finger and scream at them because it was their fault. They chose to do that, even though I accept it's a deterministic universe. Now, once we think that way, I think the application of blame and credit will differ for people versus machines. Or to put it another way, I really like this question, to put it another way, the extent to which we talk about AIs as being blameworthy will directly connect to the extent we think of them as conscious sentient beings.
I think that is a great answer to that question. And it is, I'd also love that question, Max. Thank you for that. There's other question from Mike who asks, what do we do? This is related to the question, I guess, of AI. What do we do that is qualitatively rather than quantitatively different between a stochastic parrot and a human?
So it's a question of a lot of debate. And I actually think that there's an answer to it. And it's actually framed very nicely by my friend, the AI guy, Gary Marcus, who says these machines just do statistical machines. They make probabilistic judgments, but they aren't fully capable of logic and symbolic representation. So a machine will watch a chess game, a statistical machine watch a chess game and say, there seems to be a generalization that a pawn moves 1 or 2 at the first move. But a person could say, no, that's a rule. Even if once out of every 10,000 times I see it moving 3 or moving diagonally because it's a mistake, that's just violating a rule. It's not more data. We make a distinction between all or nothing rules and statistical generalizations. And this could make a difference. So there's cases where these AIs are fragile. They hallucinate. And one argument is they hallucinate because they don't distinguish between what's really true and what's highly probable. These AI machines also kind of collapse when doing mathematics at a high level, just because there's not that much statistical information of what happens when you multiply this 20-digit number and this 20-digit number. So it may be our capacity for symbolic reason, for doing things like if X, then Y, X, Y, that actually makes us special. Now, this is not in principle. So as Gary and many other people argue, you could program an AI that has these things, then it'll become a lot more like a human. But at this point, we don't have that.